1. I first met Fred after there had been some ongoing issues between him and some of my co-workers. The apartments I work for have different locations, so while I at times have many co-workers, we do not always work in the same location and sometimes never actually meet in person or even over the phone, depending on shifts. Fred lived at a complex I did not work at with his wife. His AC had died and he waited a week to report the issue. When he finally did, it was late in the afternoon on a Friday, before a long holiday weekend. Maintenance tried to fix the issue, but the whole AC needed to be replaced. They placed an order, but the earliest new AC would arrive was the following Tuesday. This was explained to Fred and he seemed to understand. He said he'd been living with it for a week, what was a few more days. They offered to put him up in a hotel for the weekend, but he declined, saying it was too inconvenient. He then immediately went to the regional office and went postal on the regional manager. Called her and the girl in his local office a lot of terrible names. Said he'd get them all fired. This didn't happen and they had him removed from the office. This only made him angrier, so in a last-ditch attempt to make him happy, they agreed to let him stay in a model apartment. The only issue was that there was no model available at the complex, so they sent him to mine. I knew nothing when they sent him my way. My boss just called to say, "Hey, we're sending someone to stay in your model." When Fred arrived, he was a sweaty, squat, angry little man. He yelled at me about them for a good hour. When residents are angry, I usually let them yell until it's all out, because it rarely helps to yell back. After he was done, I apologized to him that he was having such a rough time. Got him set up in the model, offered him some water from our fridge, and steered him towards the clubhouse TV. This apparently was the right thing to do, because Fred thought I was an angel after that. Then, once his AC was fixed, he went home and was not my problem anymore. A few months after the AC scenario went down, I got moved to Fred's complex. He apparently had been a nightmare since then, constantly throwing fits at the office staff and yelling at people taking tours, shouting that the complex was terrible and not to live there. When I arrived, he never behaved this way around me, instead scheduling many of his trips to the office around my time off to assure he could yell at someone. This didn't mean he came to the office any less when I was there. When I was at work, he would bring candy, fruit, ice cream, trinkets, and various other gifts for me, tokens of appreciation. He would also get so overwhelmed with appreciation that he'd demand at least one hug every time he was in the office. My co-workers at the new complex warned me to tread lightly around Fred. He was a loose cannon. He thought I was amazing now, but even the slightest rejection could make him suddenly hate me. Prior to the AC breaking, he'd been just as sickly sweet to the other girls working in the office. With no other option, I would accept his gifts, they'd end up in the trash, and give him his hugs, afraid of what would happen if I refused him. All of this was unpleasant, but not nearly as terrible as what I dealt with Gary. Until about the time Fred moved out, his situation had changed suddenly. He worked at a school he originally told me as a teacher, but I later found out he was actually a janitor, and got fired after he was caught peeping on girls in the restroom. He of course denied this. Still, without an income, he couldn't afford the rent, and we agreed to let him out early, just glad to be rid of him. He was very thankful, towards me only, and on his move-out day came once again to express his gratitude. This included a hug that was at least a minute long. He also told me how lucky my husband is, how beautiful I am, and how he'd marry me in a heartbeat. All while his wife stood and watched. It was one of the most awkward things I've been through. She just stared at me the entire time. After it was over, I gave her a hug too, just so it wouldn't seem like I was out to steal her elderly husband. They left, forgetting to turn in all of their keys. Fred sent his wife to return them the next day. I'd never had too many dealings with his wife, but she made me uncomfortable. She never spoke, never smiled, and almost never came out of their apartment. The only time I had to go in their apartment, she sat and faced a corner the entire time I was there. The place was stuffed full of taxidermy. When she brought me the keys, she recounted again how terrible the complex and all the employees were, spare me. She then singled out one of my co-workers off at the time, called her a derogatory name, blamed her for the AC issue, and said very seriously, "If I ever run into that bitch on the streets, I'll kill her." Once Fred's wife left, I called my co-worker to pass on the warning. This all happened a few years ago now, and Fred still comes into the office, randomly, to check on his gal and ask for hugs. I now play the role of chronically ill with the flu when he comes in. Fred and his wife weren't as big an issue as Gary was, but certainly had us on edge while they lived there. It also scares me knowing they refuse to go quietly into the past, like most ex-residents. 2. I was in a psych ward in January. I was pretty medicated out in there, but I still remember the people I met, and who I gave my information to. Every time I visit the psych ward, I make lots of friends, like with everyone. I actually have a pretty fun time in there, to be honest. So I usually end up giving some of the less unstable people my Facebook name or phone number, depending on a lot of factors, mostly being if they are a woman, I'm female, and if they seem mostly with it mentally. So anyway, after I was discharged, I was put into an outpatient program, where I had to visit the same hospital every 2 weeks. I got a call from some random number. It looked like a hospital number. I had memorized a bunch of their numbers for emergency things. Anyway, I answer. Some guy, clearly First Nations by the accent, says, "Oh hey Scarlett, how's it going?" I was a little surprised by this, but I'm polite and respond I'm doing well. And then I ask who this is. He says, "Oh, it's Kane," not real name. And he had some questions and needed some help processing some things about being in a psych ward. So I answer his questions and try to coach him through his issues. The whole time I'm talking to him, I'm thinking, who the fuck is this? I don't recognize his voice, but I felt bad that he was having a hard time and wanted to help. Anyway, we said goodbye and I didn't think much of it until the next week when I get another call from him, basically asking the same kinds of questions about the psych ward. Again, I'm nice and try to help. Basically, these calls go on for a few weeks. I tell him he should start writing down his frustrations with the staff, nurses, and doctors, instead of yelling at them so much, and presenting a list of things that upset him and goals he would like to reach to his doctors so they can see him organizing his thoughts and not being so explosive. He tells me he has no journal or anything. I was visiting the hospital the next day for an outpatient appointment, and I had already told one of my psych ward gal pals that I would bring her some treats to share with the others, so I offered to bring him a journal. He told me what ward he was on, and that's when it dawned on me I really had no idea who this guy was. He was staying on a forensics unit, which I was never on, which usually meant some sort of crime was committed by the patient. But being determined to figure this out, I went to bring him a journal. As soon as I saw him, I knew I had never seen him before. He had a teardrop tattoo under his eye, and was very frightening. I gave him the journal and left, basically. I was super creeped out. How on earth did he get my number and name? He continued to call once a week. I stopped answering. And then one day I get a call from a random number I don't recognize. I answer, and it was a lady stating that she's Kane's lawyer, and she asked me a couple of questions. I told her that he just started calling me randomly, and I really didn't know the guy or how he got my number in the first place. We say goodbye, and then a minute later she calls back and says, "Oh, just so you know, Kane told me you invited him to live with you once he's discharged. He knows your address. You live at 123 Fake Street, right?" I freak the fuck out. I have never given him that offer or even my address to any other patient in the hospital. How the fuck did he know all this? I blocked all the hospital numbers and continue on living. This time watching my back and freaking out every time I'm home alone or have to leave the house. Then one day I get a text from a random number saying it's Kane and that he got kicked out of the hospital for assaulting a nurse. I tell him to leave me alone and fuck off or I'll get the police involved. I blocked the number, but he just kept finding other phones to text or call me on, harassing me non-stop. I blocked all those numbers. I haven't heard from him in a couple of months. but still shit scared he might just show up at my house. I gotta keep the peace agreement with the police and hope that keeps him at bay. Long story, I'm sorry, but yeah, Kane, let's not fucking meet, ever. Meet, ever. 3. I was 16 at the time, I believe. It was September. I was left home alone for the first prolonged time. 3 weeks whilst my mom and her fella, and her BFF and husband, went on a cruise to Mexico. I was not living teen life to the full, let me tell you. I'd go to work in the bar she ran, and come home and play video games, watch TV, loiter around online. You know, typical 17-year-old girl stuff. I didn't have many friends, so I wasn't exactly hosting nightly shindigs. Nope. This was pure and simple me time. Except I kind of had someone keeping an eye on me. An employee of my mum's who had become a family friend, Annie. We'd hang out, watch a movie, order food, that kind of thing. I went to hers a couple of times, she'd swing by after work. It was good. I felt like an adult, responsible, grown up. Adulting all the way. Now the 3 weeks had gone by pretty easily, life was simple. And then, as luck would have it, on the final night before my mum flew home, the dogs somehow managed to wriggle their way out of the front door. It's 15 or so years ago now, I forget the finer details. And off they go, full speed ahead. 2 big dogs, 1 little dog, William Wallacing their way to freedom. Shit. This was all I needed, right? So I call Annie. It's getting late, it's dark out. And I don't know exactly where they're heading. But I'll be damned if I'm walking there alone. Annie says she'll pick me up and drive me down and we'll shout the dogs together. I grew up on a smallish estate, with a multitude of little cul-de-sacs in a kind of loop. At one side was the motorway, but the other side, about a 20-minute walk, was a country park called Cureton Valley. The kind of place that was beautiful to wander around on a summer day, with a river that cut through the center, and a huge lake to greet you when you walked in from our side. It was a gorgeous place I'd taken the dogs to many a time. But at night time, whole other story. That place was a murderer's dream. There were hills and dips and woodland, and if you dumped a body in the water, I'm pretty sure it had not have surfaced for a long while. No way was I trotting around there on my own, but those damn dogs sure would. By the time Annie arrived, they'd have been gadding around the fields and jumping in the river and Lord knows what else. But it was a fair walk to the lake from any of the 4 entrances. So Annie picked the back car park and headed there. We pulled into the car park, and there's a car, nothing too unexpected. It was secluded enough for a good make-out session or illicit affair. The car looked empty. Annie parked, we got out. I shouted the dogs a few times, listened intently, but nothing, not a peep. So I get back in and we decide to go to the next car park along, not thinking if the dogs came running I'd not be there. It was late, we were tired. We were about to pull out of the car park. The parked car flashes their headlights with some urgency. Annie stops dead, checks her lights, looks at me in silence. I ask if she thinks they need help. She responds that the car looked empty. I ease the tension with jokes about dogging and the guy probably having his seat reclined to give his girlfriend a better angle. Annie decides to circle back once more. We crawl past the car. It didn't have blacked-out windows, and it wasn't much of a boy racer car. You couldn't see inside because of the dark, but as we turned the corner toward the exit again, her brake lights on the driver window let us pick out the shape of a man. Sat bolt upright, looking ahead. Not looking at us, just staring right ahead. I exclaimed that there was a person, and both of us getting rattled. She made to set off out of there. And then the headlights started flashing again. We weren't stupid enough to go back in there as 2 young women. We'd seen him, so he'd surely seen us. We were heading along the main road now, and still his lights were flashing away as I glanced back. Maybe he really did need help. Maybe he was suicidal. Maybe he could see the dogs and was signaling us back. We were torn, but too apprehensive to put ourselves in danger. The flashing disappeared when we crested a hill on the main road, and Annie pulled into the side and called the police. Situated conveniently about 1.5 miles away, she explained that this person kept flashing their lights, and maybe someone should go check on them. The operator was dubious about the behavior and said they'd send a patrol car, and we should go home. We both sat there for a long while weighing up the options of lost dogs and creepy car guy. It was at that moment that the car tore past us, easily clocking 60 miles per hour, and we were maybe 600 yards away from the entrance, so he must have absolutely floored it. The car wobbled, he shot by that fast. It was like he knew we'd call the police, and Annie, in her infinite wisdom, decided to try and follow him. She reasoned it was to see if the police were on their way, but I think she was just curious. We drove on into a small township, one long road right through with zero traffic at this hour, and decided that maybe we should wait at the car park for the police and explain. Annie understandably didn't want the trouble of a suspected hoax call, so we doubled back and set off toward the car park, maybe 2 minutes away. And then that goddamn car came toward us, flashing wildly again, from the direction we'd come from. There was no way he'd passed us the opposite way because nobody had. And to get back to the starting point, he'd have had to go one of 2 ways for at least 10 minutes just to loop us. How did he end up behind us, and how did he know which direction we'd taken at the lights? Many questions were unspoken, but almost deafening in the car. We paused at the main lights, left for home, right for Preston, straight ahead to drive alongside the park. Straight on she went. The only words we exchanged were, "What the fuck?" and "I don't know." And then the car was coming toward us again, from up near the car park, flashing wildly, and right by us he sped. Annie swung the car in the middle of the road and set after him. I remember a high-pitched, "What are you doing?" wheezing out of me. And I genuinely don't know if she knew, but he'd sparked some kind of vendetta in her. We'd lost him instantly, though, and it was then that the patrol car came toward us, heading toward the car park we'd started in. And so Annie once again turned around and headed to the car park too. She wanted to talk to the policeman. Neither of us felt that good about the creepy car who was tailing us. Neither of us knew how to explain it either, but we could try. As we neared the car park entrance, the police car was just idling, waiting to pull out. "Oh my God," Annie whispered, and I looked over to see her ashen face looking in the mirror. He was behind us, flashing his high beams intermittently. Common sense would have dictated we pull into the car park, but both of us were freaked out, and in the back of my mind, I still had the dogs to find. And she just carried on right by the police car without taking her eyes off the rear-view mirror for more than a couple of seconds at a time. The car followed, and after a second or two, I watched in the mirror as the police car pulled out to follow us too. Now the road we were on is pretty long, and there are several sets of lights with crossroads. Annie was tense, I was tense, and all I could say was, "Don't let him follow us home." Annie nodded. "We'll drive until he's gone. He won't do anything with the police behind him." And Annie played it cool. All the lights stayed green, meaning we couldn't shake him. So Annie tried taking turns without signaling, but still the convoy followed. Close to Chorley, her hometown, she signaled a turn, and as she took it, the creepy car guy floored it, shooting off straight ahead, and the police car put on the blues and sped after him. Shaken, Annie stopped for a few minutes at the side of the road. Again, the same 2 phrases passed between us, "What the fuck?" and "I don't know." Eventually, when we saw no other cars, we headed back to my house. And as we pulled up, all 3 dogs were sat there, all happy, waggy tails, so glad we were back. I've never resented them so much in my life, the little shits. But we got inside, got a cup of tea to calm our nerves, and sat down recounting the episode. It was creepier than I can do justice, but needless to say, we were freaked out by how he kept appearing ahead of us, coming toward us. What would have happened if we got out of the car again? We still talk about it occasionally, when we get together and want to spook each other. My mum got home the next day. The dogs got out on more adventures in the following years, but never with creepy car guy around. It was certainly an experience, if a freaky one. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 299. Thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, we're almost at the... Somebody farting about in a motorbike again? We're almost at the big 300. That will be on Monday. And I'm going to be working on it gradually over the course of this week. It's going to be a big one. Okay, and with that, I'm going to keep this outro a bit short. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.